Gruul loves to Hulk smash, except when it doesn't. This time, you'll make your opponents do the smashing with Kaima the Fractured Calm. Welcome to the Commander's Beacon. I am Eric, and on this channel we'd like to discuss unconventional commander decks and strategies. But before I get to that, the Commander's Beacon has recently launched a Discord server. Come and join us and discuss some unique ways to play in Magic the Gathering's best format. Or maybe play some games. You can find the invite link to the Discord server in the description, and the Discord server is open to everyone. Okay, now Goad is one of my favorite mechanics in Commander. Making all those utility value creatures like Thrasios and Zulaport Cutthroat just throw themselves to their deaths during the combat phase feels really good. So of course I've built the classic Rakdos Goad commanders like Carter Doomscourge and Karazikar the Eye Tyrant. But now we have a new color combination for a Goad deck. We can play Gruul with Kaima the Fractured Calm. Now Kaima is a 3/3 legendary boar god. No wait, that's its brother Ilharg. Kaima is just a spirit. It costs 2 red green, and Kaima has, at the beginning of your end step, goad each creature your opponents control that's enchanted by an aura you control. Put a +1/+1 counter on Kaima the Fractured Calm for each creature goaded this way. So Kaima will goad each creature your opponents control that's enchanted by an aura you control at the beginning of each of your end steps. So Kaima goads those creatures repeatedly as long as it's on the battlefield. Now there's decent removal auras like Lignify that you can put on your opponent's creatures, but goading a lignified creature is usually rather pointless. Or you can go for powerhouse auras like Colossification. Just be aware that if Kaima goes away, that colossified creature will stop being goaded and might just attack you. So we need to walk a fine line in this deck regarding our choice of auras. Actually, Kaima loves bad auras. We want auras that cost almost no mana and pretty much do nothing. We want auras that no other deck will touch. But we also need to figure out some other strategies for winning the game. Goad can help us get there, but by itself I found that Goad is not a reliable win condition. First, our opponents might not have any creatures, and in that case Kaima literally does nothing. Secondly, if we've eliminated 2 players and we only have a single opponent remaining, goading that player won't prevent them from attacking us. So Goad gets a lot worse when you're playing 1 versus 1. Now we do have some solutions to that problem in this deck, but before we get to those, let's talk about some of those bad auras. Now like I said, Kaima loves auras that have a low mana cost and don't do anything. Generally bad cards, because you don't want to give good buffs to your opponent's creatures just to goad them. Like we'll use Fiery Mantle. This 2 mana aura gives the enchanted creature Firebreathing, which is again literally nothing unless you pay mana into it. And even if you enchant an opponent's creature, you still control the aura, so only you can pay mana into that Firebreathing, not your opponent. And Fiery Mantle returns to your hand if it's put into the graveyard from the battlefield. So this is actually the first category of auras that we really like with Kaima. Those auras that come back to our hand when they go to the graveyard from the battlefield, so we can use them over and over again, even when the enchanted creature dies. And so there's a few more auras like this. There's classics like Rancor, there's Fortitude, which also literally does nothing unless you sacrifice a forest to regenerate the enchanted creature. But again, Fortitude does recur itself from your graveyard. There's Undying Rage, which gives a power toughness boost and prevents the enchanted creature from blocking. Aspect of Mongoose gives the enchanted creature Shroud, which is nice to use on your own creatures, but just be careful about giving this kind of protection to your opponent's creatures. And then there's the new Unquenchable Fury. This is another one that returns itself to your hand if it's put into the graveyard from the battlefield. This one costs a little bit more at 2 and a red, and it gives the enchanted creature, when this creature attacks, it deals X damage to defending player, where X is the number of cards in their hand, which is kind of hilarious. If you enchant an opponent's creature with this and then goad it, it's sure to do some serious damage. Again, this triggers on attack, not even dealing combat damage. Just be careful, because if that enchanted creature stops being goaded, it could swing at you. But now we have other self-recurring auras that recover themselves in different ways. Escape Velocity, for example, grants haste, and it has escape, so you can cast it from your graveyard by paying 1 and a red and exiling 2 other cards from your graveyard. And then there's Mark of Fury, which is great. It also grants the enchanted creature haste, and at the end of your turn, you return Mark of Fury to its owner's hand, just in time to let Kaima goad the enchanted creature first. And of course there's Whip Silk, which is only ever used if it's abused. This 1-mana aura pretty much does nothing, but you can return it to its owner's hand for just a single green mana, whenever you want, letting you bounce it and recast it over and over, triggering all of your other enchantment synergies, which we will talk about later. But there are other low-cost, trashy value auras that we can just jam in this deck. Frog Tongue, for example, was only printed once, in Tempest, in 1997, but it's still only 18 cents. This disturbing little card, yet look at that art, this gives the enchanted creature reach, and more importantly, when Frog Tongue comes into play, you draw a card, so it replaces itself. And that's actually pretty great. And we've got some more auras like this. Dragon Mantle, for example, is another useless 1-mana aura that gives the enchanted creature Firebreathing, but you draw a card when it enters the battlefield. Karametra's Favor turns a creature into a mana dork and replaces itself. And then we've got Rune of Might and Rune of Speed, which give out nice little buffs, and again, they replace themselves. Now, as long as we're enchanting our opponent's creatures and forcing them into combat, we might as well generate some value when they do attack. Bequeathal, for example, is a 1-mana aura, and it lets us draw 2 cards when the enchanted creature dies, which is perfect for enchanting and goading a small creature on the opponent's battlefield, which will likely die in combat. Mortal Wound says, if enchanted creature is dealt damage, destroy it. So it's perfect for enchanting big creatures on the opponent's side of the battlefield to kill them when they're forced to swing in and hopefully get blocked. Alakalith Rig, now this is a fun one. It has whenever enchanted creature becomes blocked, you may have it deal damage equal to its power to target creature. If you do, the first creature assigns no combat damage this turn. So you can put this on an opponent's creature and you still get to control the trigger of Alakalith Rig, letting it kill whatever you want. Keen Sense lets you draw a card whenever the enchanted creature deals combat damage to a player. One with Nature lets you get a basic land from your library whenever the enchanted creature deals combat damage to a player. And Latula's Orders lets you destroy a target artifact defending player controls when the enchanted creature deals combat damage to a player. But it's a May ability, so you don't have to do it, so you don't need to worry if that creature manages to attack you. I mean, there's barely any artifacts in this deck anyways, but just in case you were concerned. And then Flowstone Blade lets you pay a red to give the enchanted creature +1/-1 until end of turn. So if you can spend enough red mana, Flowstone Blade can actually be an expensive sorcery speed removal spell, which is just what we all wanted. And with all of these dorky little auras, we'll use a few decent ones too. At first there's Ancestral Mask, which gives the enchanted creature +2/+2 for each other enchantment in play, which can be a lot. You can put this on an opponent's creature to goad it, but again, be very careful if you do. I'd much rather play this on one of my own creatures for a surprise blowout. And then of course we'll use Vow of Lightning, Vow of Wildness, and Shiny Impetus. These auras support Kaima in forcing or at least encouraging our opponents to fight amongst themselves and leave us alone. The Vow auras give a buff and prevent the creature from attacking you, but they don't force the creature to attack. The Impetus auras, like Shiny Impetus, goad the creature permanently so it has to attack, but again it can attack you if there are no other targets to attack. And lastly, let's talk about a new one from the Commander Precon, Smoke Spirit's Aid. It isn't an aura, it's a sorcery. This spell costs X and a red, and it says for each of up to X target creatures, create a red aura enchantment token named Smoke Blessing attached to that creature. Those tokens have Enchant Creature, and when Enchanted Creature dies, it deals 1 damage to its controller, and you create a treasure token. So this is a very weird card. Basically, you pay X and a red to create X token auras enchanting X target creatures. So you're going to make a ton of auras all at once, but you can only put one such aura on any given creature. So you can't just dump a bunch of them onto a single creature. And then when one of those enchanted creatures dies, you get a treasure, and the creature's controller takes 1 damage. So first, this can goad a bunch of creatures all at once with Kaima. And since you're generating a bunch of auras, you'll also generate a bunch of triggers from some of our other enchantment synergies, which again we'll get to in a minute. Now eventually those auras will also ramp you and ping your opponents, but this effect is most likely going to be delayed, you won't get it right away, and it's kind of uncontrollable, so I wouldn't really rely on it. Mostly Smoke Spirit's Aid will just give you a bunch of aura ETB triggers, or just goad a bunch of things with Kaima, and by itself that's already pretty good. So those are all of the little auras that we'll use to have Kaima goad our opponent's creatures into doing our bidding, or at least killing themselves off. But like I said before, goad alone will not win games most of the time. So as long as we're playing with a bunch of auras, let's go over some alternative uses for them. Now, as long as we're playing with a bunch of cheap, dumb auras, we'll play some creatures that care all about aura quantity at the expense of quality. Like Champion of the Flame, which has trample and gets +2/+2 for each aura attached to it. So if your opponents don't have any good targets to goad, or if Kaima's indisposed, or if you just find it more beneficial at this point in the game for you to do the face beating yourself, a Champion of Flame will happily eat up all of your auras for you and become massive. And see, all of these auras that we've chosen in this deck, we've mostly picked auras that give some minor benefit or maybe don't do much at all. We haven't included too many auras that make creatures weaker. And that was intentional. That's so that we can use these auras on our opponent's creatures or on our own, whichever is more beneficial at the time. So we can put those auras on something like Champion of the Flame without hurting ourselves in the process. Now we'll also use the new Kami of Transience. This is another 2-mana creature with trample, and it gets a +1/+1 counter whenever you cast an enchantment spell. We have 42 of them in this deck, and like we mentioned, several of them are self-recurring, so Kami of Transience can get big. Now, Kami of Transience also has, at the beginning of each end step, if an enchantment was put into your graveyard from the battlefield this turn, you may return Kami of Transience from your graveyard to your hand. This is going to happen pretty much all the time, as your goaded creatures will kill themselves, so Kami of Transience will keep coming back from the dead until it gets exiled. There's also Aura Gnarlid, which gets +1/+1 for each aura on the battlefield. It doesn't care what that aura is attached to, or even who controls it, so that's nice. Even better, Aura Gnarlid can't be blocked by creatures with less power than it, so it can be a decent finisher. We'll use Valduk, Keeper of the Flame, which makes 3/1 hasty creature tokens at the beginning of combat on your turn, for each aura attached to it. And those tokens are exiled at the end of the turn, but Valduk will keep making disposable attackers turn after turn. A Broodkeeper also makes tokens. Those are 2/2 flying dragons with Firebreathing, to be exact, whenever it's enchanted by an aura. Now, those tokens don't have haste, but they also don't die at the end of the turn, unlike the ones made with Valduk, so Broodkeeper can just keep on generating a lot of value. Bramble Elemental does the same, except instead of making a single 2/2 dragon for each time it's enchanted, it makes 2 1/1 Saprolings. And of course we'll use the new Upgrades Unleashed Precon commander here too. Chihiro the Shattered Blade is a perfect fit in this deck. It makes 2/2 creature tokens with Menace whenever an aura or equipment enters the battlefield under your control. Now Chihiro doesn't care what you enchant, as long as you play an enchantment. It makes a 2/2. And Chihiro also grows your team by giving each of your modified creatures a +1/+1 counter at the end of your turn. That is, each creature you control that is equipped, enchanted, or has a counter of any kind on it. So those are some of the creatures that we'll use to turn our cheap auras into win conditions. Now there's only a few of them in this deck, 7 to be exact, but you don't really want to have more than one of these on the field at a time, since most of them are going to need to have enchantments placed on them to do anything. And each of your auras can only target one creature at a time, so there's not really much value in having more than one of these on the battlefield, for the most part. And now let's talk about some of our other aura and enchantment payoffs. Now we've got plenty of aura and enchantment synergy to fill the deck's card draw, ramp, and removal slots. For card draw, of course, we'll use Green's Enchantress effects, like Argothian Enchantress, Setessan Champion, and Eidolon of Blossoms. The new Concord with the Kami is a 4-mana enchantment that lets you draw a card at the end of your turn, if you control an enchanted creature. It does some other things if you control an equipped creature or a creature with a counter on it, which you might since Kaima gives itself +1/+1 counters, but mostly this is here for the card draw. There's Colossal Majesty, which costs 3 mana. It's an enchantment, and it has at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card. Now, we don't have a ton of creatures in this deck, but most of the time Kaima will have at least 4 power, since even though it only starts with 3, it will get a +1/+1 counter whenever it goads something. And if it's not going to goad anything, why would you cast it? So our commander will usually enable Colossal Majesty pretty easily. There's Gnarlback Rhino, which is a 4-mana 4/4 with Trample that has you draw a card whenever you cast a spell that targets it, so this is going to include all of your auras. It's great for holding auras like Ancestral Mask and helping you refill your hand and when there aren't many creatures on your opponent's side of the field that you want to goad. Or, of course, you can just turn all of your creatures into Gnarlback Rhino with Season of Growth. For only 2 mana, this enchantment has whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you scry 1, but more importantly, whenever you cast a spell that targets a creature you control, draw a card. And again, that'll trigger whenever we put an aura on one of our creatures. So even though Kaima encourages us to enchant our opponent's creatures to goad them, we'll still get value from enchanting our own creatures, either to attack with or block with, or to get triggers from our Chihiro or Broodkeeper and whatnot. So Season of Growth will help us generate even more value. Now when it comes to mana ramp, we'll of course use a lot of auras that enchant lands, like Wild Growth, Wolf Willow Haven, and Overgrowth, which will ramp us while also triggering our enchantment synergies like Citizen Champion. Now I also like Font of Fertility and Omen of the Hunt, which give us a less vulnerable land-based ramp, but also an enchantment form. The Sanctum Weaver is an obvious include, it's an enchantment creature, so again it triggers our enchantment synergies. But it also taps for mana equal to the number of enchantments you control, which again can be a lot. But I also really like Nature's Embrace. Now this aura costs 2 and a green, and it can enchant a creature or a land. As long as the enchanted permanent is a creature, it gets +2/+2. As long as the enchanted permanent is a land, it has tap to add 2 mana of any one color. So Nature's Embrace is perfect here. If you want to buff your Champion of the Flame, Nature's Embrace will do it. If you want to goad an opponent's creature with Kaima, Nature's Embrace facilitates. If you just need the mana ramp, you can enchant a land and, get more mana out of it. So it's a really flexible card. Now when it comes to removal, I've already mentioned some of our auras, like Flowstone Blade and Laccolith Rig. We'll use standard Gruul removal like Chaos Warp and Generous Gift, and my personal favorite, Tybalt's Trickery, because that's right, suck it blue, we can counter spells too. We'll also use Cindervines because it's an enchantment. It costs red-green, and it deals 1 damage to an opponent whenever they cast a non-creature spell, so that's nice. You can also pay 1 and sacrifice Cindervines to destroy a target artifact or enchantment and deal 2 damage to its controller. And Kenrith's Transformation elks a creature. The enchanted creature becomes a 3/3 elk and loses all abilities. And it also draws you a card, so it replaces itself. Now Kenrith's Transformation may not be as effective of removal as something like Song of the Dryads, but we can use it to goad a creature with Kaima, which you can't really do with Song of the Dryads. And again, I like that Kenrith's Transformation replaces itself. Now finally, I want to mention a couple of our other enchantment payoffs. First, of course, we're using Destiny Spinner, which is an enchantment deck staple. For only 2 mana, this is a 2/3 enchantment creature. It makes your creature and enchantment spells uncounterable, and it can animate your lands into big elemental creatures with trample and power and toughness equal to the number of enchantments you control. This card is really pushed, and it's an obvious fit in any deck that cares about enchantments. And then there's other enchantment support creatures out there. Some gain you life when you play an enchantment, some reduce the cost of your enchantment spells, but our enchantments are already pretty cheap, and I don't really like life gain for the sake of life gain most of the time. But I have chosen to include Nessian Wanderer. Now this is a 2 mana 1/3 Satyr Scout. It isn't an enchantment, but it does have Constellation. Whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, you look at the top 3 cards of your library. You may reveal a land card from among them and put it into your hand, and you put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So Nessian Wanderer provides consistent value, basically card draw, as long as that card draws land, and it helps you make your land drops, of course. And that's most of the deck. Now let's go over the deck stats and cost. Now this Kaima the Fractured Calm deck has a really aggressive average mana cost of only 2.36. I'll say that again, 2.36. we're really focused on low-cost auras in this deck. There are 9 cards in the deck that cost 4 mana, 1 card that costs 5 mana, and everything else is 3 mana or less. Except for Blasphemous Act, technically, but realistically this one is usually just 2 mana most of the time. Now the deck has 42 enchantments, of which 31 are auras. We could probably call it 32 auras if we count Smoke Spirit's Aid, which makes enchantments, or makes auras. Now, not counting our commander, this deck has 18 cards that reward us for playing enchantments. Of course, this includes our enchantress effects like Eidolon of Blossoms. It includes our creatures that like to get suited up with auras like Chihiro, and other things like Ancestral Mask, which buffs up a creature based on the number of enchantments on the field. This deck has 13 sources of card draw and 11 sources of mana ramp. Now, just note that a few of those effects are auras that are a bit situational, like Bequeathal, which only draws us cards when the enchanted creature dies, or One with Nature, which only ramps us when the enchanted creature deals combat damage to a player. And then finally, this deck has 13 pieces of single target removal and 2 board wipes. Again, just be aware that some of those removal spells are on auras that are, again, a bit situational, like Mortal Wound, which destroys the enchanted creature when it's dealt damage, or Latula's Orders, which destroys an artifact, but only if it's controlled by a player dealt damage by the creature enchanted by Latula's Orders. At the time of this recording, this deck has a value of $138.11 on TCGplayer.com. By the way, $40 of that cost, or nearly 1/3 of the total deck value, is found in just one card, Argothian Enchantress, which is a really good card. It's a 2-mana Enchantress with Shroud, so that's kind of as good as you're going to get. Nonetheless, if you remove Argothian Enchantress, you'll make this deck even more budget-friendly. There are no other cards in the deck that cost over $10, and only one card that costs more than $5. So this could be a reasonably budget deck, if that's what you're going for. So that's Kaima the Fractured Calm. Again, this is a new color combination for a Go deck, which generally have been operating within the Rakdos color pairing. I guess there's also Marisi, which also includes red and green, but goading with Marisi, much like Kaima, requires its own very special assortment of support cards. Now, compared to other Goad decks, you're obviously playing an enchantment-themed deck here with Kaima in the command zone. And even more specifically, an Auras deck. And I want to reiterate that typically Goad decks will require some additional finishers. A Goad as a mechanic, as fun as it is, just won't win games on its own most of the time. And our finishers in this deck are fairly standard Gruul fare. We'll either go wide with tokens using something like Broodkeeper or Chihiro, or we'll go tall with something like Aura Gnarlid or Champion of the Flame. Either way, we're getting it for combat damage. Or we can even use Kaima itself, because if we've goaded enough creatures, Kaima can get pretty big, and that's just a matter of giving it trample, which we have a few auras in our deck that will do that. Now, I really liked that with all of our Enchantress effects and cantrip auras and our low average mana cost in this deck, you'll really be able to churn through this deck and cast a lot of spells, which is pretty unique in Gruul. And I also like that this deck has you playing a lot of cards that no other commander deck wants. It's kind of like Feather in that regard. But that is all I've got for today. Let me know in the comments what you think about Kaima the Fractured Calm, or any other commanders or other cards from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty that you're interested in. Or even better, share your discussion in the channel's new Discord. Again, you can see the link in the description for the invite, and the Discord is open to everyone. Stick around as we'll have more Kamigawa Neon Dynasty content coming up soon, including a ninjutsu deck, and I'm hoping to build a non-vehicles deck using the Buckle Up alternate Precon Commander Shorikai Genesis engine. I'm also hoping to build a vehicles deck using Greasefang Okiba Boss. There are a lot of cool new vehicles in Kamigawa, and I'd love to take advantage of them in such a deck. But anyways, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.